Firstly, thanks for the invitation to be part of the meeting today. I think it's, as we talked about it yesterday evening in advance, I think it is fair to say that this is a fairly significant and important part of system building that we haven't actually discussed to any degree. And I think we could probably ask ourselves why. I did share a fear just before the break with somebody that maybe we're actually discussing it after the horse has already bolted out of the stable and now we're trying to close the door. But I will sort of leave that sentiment aside. I'm also very conscious of the fact that as I saw the panel, or the structure of the panels, I was thinking, okay, so we're going to hear that the public one, it's got great potential, but it's going to be hard to get going. We're also going to hear that in the for-profit sector, we've got to have consideration. So you're all going to turn to the non-profit panel and say, you're the guys who are going to get us out of this mess, aren't you? And I'm not sure we are, but I'll just leave that remark aside. So I'm going to try to speak to four things, picking up a little bit on what was said in the previous panels. I would like to start off with perhaps the more sort of theoretical and conceptual stuff and say that I do believe when we look at the concept and the ideas and the values that are behind nonprofit organizations, that I do think we can see how those values can be consistent and important in building an early learning and childcare system. So we can see the really potential for nonprofit organizations to play in part of building a more publicly managed system. That said, going on a little bit, Ashlyn mentioned this at the remarks today. I'm also going to talk a little bit about, not in great detail, a little bit about some of the differences between nonprofits. Not all nonprofits are the same, and I think that's something that we need to talk about and discuss far more deeply and broadly than I'm going to discuss today. Then I'll talk a little bit about just Alberta and Saskatchewan. So I work for a private charitable foundation, and we work mainly in Alberta, Saskatchewan. And Alberta and Saskatchewan have a lot in common in terms of both being rather, shall we say, socially conservative and fiscally conservative, and yet they've got very different early learning and childcare sectors. One entirely not-for-profit and one more for-profit. Tell you a little bit about that. And then I'll conclude with some observations on what we as a private foundation who work primarily with charities, when we've talked to charities who are looking at perhaps expanding or being encouraged to expand, just tell you some of the things that they're saying to us in terms of what they might need to support that expansion. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So I do go back to what Michelle said at the beginning. I think we can, all of us, and I'm as guilty as anybody, we can sort of lament in some ways how difficult it is to build a system. But I chatted to Martha last night, and I was saying, well, when was the last time you were in Winnipeg? And Martha and I, the last time we were both in Winnipeg was 2014. It was, and I think lots of other people were here. It was the National Childcare Conference. And in 2014, we did not anticipate that 10 years later, we would be talking about how are we going to build a nationally funded, public and managed childcare system. So tremendous progress. And that system is based on the premise of really fundamental changes. It's sort of transformational change. And for me, transformational change does not mean doing all of the things that you've done before, but just doing more of them. It actually means doing things differently. But just think of the change in 10 years. I remember that conference, people had signs saying "Harper out" and things like that. It was kind of, not that was that was kind of awestruck, and it worked. Yeah, it was obviously. But think of the change. Think of the change in the 10 years that we're actually standing here and talking together about how we build that system. That's an incredible advance. So in terms of just thinking about So in terms of thinking about early learning and childcare and why I think there is a critical and important role for nonprofits, I think one of the things that I've wrestled with, and I come from a private charitable foundation, and what brings us to early learning and childcare is actually child rights. When we talk about early learning and childcare from the standpoint of a private charitable foundation, what we're really interested in is the rights of the child, and we're really interested in ensuring that every child has access to high quality early learning and childcare. And we're really concerned that access is not contingent upon something. It's not linked to where that child lives or its age and level of ability. And critically, it's not linked to how much money that child's family has. It's linked to the fact that that is a child, and that child should have an access to early learning and childcare. And so when we go through early learning and childcare and we think about system building, one of the things that we've reflected on is, actually, what do we want early learning and childcare to do? What do we actually want it to do as a publicly funded and managed system? And I think we've gone through various frames of reference. You know, it's been around a long while, you sort of bounce around with different priorities. But I think we actually wanted to do a number of things. We certainly want it to be, first and foremost, these are programs for children. These are programs for very young children. So the focus should be, if I go back to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the focus should be Article 3. What is in the best interests of the child? That's the essence of the program. Yes, it should also support families' labor force participation, because families need to participate in the labor force. The labor force needs them to participate. Communities are stronger for economic development, so it should have that aspect. But it also should have the 3 and 4 bullets there. It should have real value arguments in terms of advancing gender equity and inclusion. And it should also support social solidarity and building of community. So early learning and childcare is not transactional. It's got something much more compelling than being a transactional process. And so when we think about those kind of arguments, I think we come back to, in some ways, some of the starting points for thinking about nonprofits and the role of community organizations. Because what we're trying to do is when we're building the publicly funded finance system, what we're in some ways doing is we're accepting Michael Sandel's arguments that there's limits on what markets can do. Markets can do certain things well, and there's things that they can't do well. And so we can try to sandwich things in to make them do it a little bit better. But in some ways, when we're thinking about early learning and childcare, if we've got those 3rd and 4th bullets, maybe we have to look at what the limits of markets are. So essentially, in the Canada-wide system building announcements and pledges and commitments, we've said not-for-profit and publicly funded because we're trying to avoid the diversion of profit seeking. We're trying to avoid the diversions that markets bring to how goods and services are organized and delivered. But I hope what we're also trying to do is we're also trying to build community. We're trying to develop social capital. We're trying to embed shared values and shared experiences, because we're also thinking about early learning and childcare, again, not as a private service that you turn up and buy, but as part of your social infrastructure that's a part of every community. And I think that's 2 key elements. So one, trying to avoid the diversion of markets. We're not trying to be driven by market behaviors. But secondly, we're also trying to build community and social values. Because I'm a great believer, in public education. One of the central element of public education is about socialization. It's about building community. And if we don't have those shared experiences, the NAC, which I sit on, we were in Calgary, was it last week? I don't know, maybe the week last week or maybe before. And the deputy minister was there, and he was talking about the importance of shared experiences. Where do children and families have shared experiences? And perhaps early learning and childcare is one of them. So now to get on to the hard stuff in terms of the nonprofit sector and childcare delivery. And I'm going to talk more about registered charities, because that's the world that we live in. And I think you all know that charities do play a role in regulated childcare. We actually don't know the actual nature and extent and scope of that role. That's something that we need to look at more deeply. We know in every province there are charities that are incorporated and deliver early learning and childcare, but we don't actually know enough about them to really inform the kind of policy making. I've forgotten who answered the question, is how do you take a political goal and translate it into public policy? You need to know a lot about the kind of instruments that you're planning to use if you're going to do that. And we don't know enough about charities, but we do know that they play a role in every province. But when we think about, well, why do they play that role? What brings charities to early learning and childcare? And they actually come through the same kind of 2 traditions that have shaped the charitable sector more broadly. And we should just reflect on the fact that in my world, we talk about the charitable and voluntary sector, and Canada's got one of the largest per capita charity and voluntary sectors in the world. I think there's only the Netherlands who has a slightly higher one, but per capita, we've got more charities and voluntary organizations than most other developed nations. And what we see is that we see it coming out of 2 traditions. The first tradition, and this is very important, it's a tradition of voluntary action and association. It's groups coming together based on shared values, shared interests, and shared beliefs, and creating some sort of service or support or program or initiative that actually has the goal of building and advancing public benefit. It could be for the public benefit of the group, or it could be more broadly. And that tradition embeds itself in what we think of very broadly as civil society. So what's civil society? Well, civil society is something between, it's a mediating set of structures between government and markets. And it's a mediating set of structures that are beyond the institution of the family. So it's individuals coming together voluntarily, without coercion, freely, to advance shared interests, shared goals with the idea of realizing public benefits. And that's a very important tradition. And that's where one of the origins of charity is. The second kind of tradition, and this is one which is a little bit contentious, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this, is this. Charities, in terms of their role in society, it's evolved largely to deliver government-funded services. So charities since the 1960s have taken on a much larger role in delivering publicly funded services. So as we built the welfare state in Canada, none of us were there, of course, because we're all far too young, but as that welfare state was built in Canada, much of that role was contingent upon governments reaching out to charitable and voluntary organizations and say, can you deliver the services that are going to be the foundation of that welfare state? So that's given us a very strong, vibrant, emergent, charitable and voluntary sector, but it's created some tensions. One of the tensions for charities is that we've been arguing that first tradition, that associative function, the people coming together as part of civil society, has been lost in the goal of delivering services. So charities themselves have become more transactional. So when you look at charities, where does their funding come from? Most of it comes from governments to deliver services. So there's a kind of a tension that's already existing that we're going to have to address. So charities are very unique beasts. We talked a little bit. I'm not a charities lawyer. So I'm not going to talk too much legal policy wonk, but charities are a very unique beast because they're regulated federally. All charities are initially incorporated as nonprofits, and then they apply for charitable status. And to get charitable status, you have to follow fairly well set out in common law charitable purposes, which include the advancement of education. But you also have to make the fundamental commitment to public benefit. That is, the activities, the purposes of the charity have to support public rather than private benefit. And what that means is that all of the assets and resources of the charity have to be devoted to advancing public benefits. So that doesn't mean that somebody who works at a charity like me doesn't get paid. I'm not a volunteer. But it means that the resources and assets of the charity must be used to advance public benefit. And that must be generally a broadly defined public benefit. It can't say, I'm going to support Chris and his family. Now, that's my charity. Please give generously, and they will succeed and prosper. It has to be a broad public benefit. And as part of that tradition, we've used the word ownership, and I've written it there just in colloquial sense. But in a charity, so charities are structured in the sense that we have members, the members elect the board of directors, and the directors then hire the staff. The assets of that charity are not owned by the members as such. They're not. What the members are stewards of those assets. They're charged with using those assets to advance public benefit and public goods. And I think somebody mentioned it, in the dissolution of a charity, when a charity is dissolved, the assets of the charity have to be gifted to another charity. Doesn't have to be, say if a childcare charity dissolves, doesn't have to gift to another childcare charity, but the assets of that charity have to be gifted. So in essence, the members of the charity, which we might think of as the owners, are really the stewards of the assets. The assets are really public assets that are being managed or looked after in good faith. So charities are very unique. They have very significant responsibilities placed on them, rightly so, because we have one of the most generous tax receiving regimes in the world. So in terms of the contributions that we make to charities, that's foregone public revenue. So when you give to charities, you get a tax break, right? So essentially that money does not go to the government. So that money must be used for public good. And so charities are kind of unique. We also have, and we touched on this morning, and I'll talk very summarily about it, we also have different types of nonprofits. So if we looked at the nonprofit sector as a whole, we'd say, how many are there? Well, there's about 170,000 of them. Is that all, you say? That's not many. About 85,000 of them are charities. About 85,000 are nonprofit organizations. And then we also have 85,000 co-ops. So when we look at the charities, nonprofits, co-ops, and I've also listed on there what we call nonprofit private companies, these are generally incorporated under different pieces of legislation. So most charities either incorporate under a federal statute nonprofit corporations and then apply for charitable status and then go into a totally different set of regimes in terms of reporting requirement obligations. A lot of nonprofits incorporate under that same federal statute and then remain as nonprofits. And Martha's Shop remains under that. Are you an extra provincial nonprofit organization? No? Yeah. So they remain under that statute. But then we also have a separate statute for cooperatives. There's a Cooperatives Act. So when cooperatives incorporate, cooperatives aren't eligible for charitable status because within a cooperative, the members receive private benefit from being part of the cooperative. That's a good thing for the members of the co-op, but they're not eligible. Oh, 5 minutes, oh good. They're not, only 4 more slides to go. They're not eligible for charitable registration. But cooperatives play an important role in our community in terms of supporting public goods. The third category I've got listed there is what we call nonprofit private companies. And this is a group that we're only starting to learn a little bit more about these. So I'll tell you about the nonprofit private companies in Alberta. They incorporate under provincial legislation, a Companies Act. And within that Companies Act, there's something called Part 9. And they incorporate as a private nonprofit company under that Part 9 section of the Alberta Companies Act. And as part of that incorporation, they have to commit to the primary goal is not to derive or generate profit. And they have to commit to the assets and the resources of that nonprofit private company are used to support sort of public goods or benefits. So in other words, they can't benefit privately from that asset. But if you look at the Articles of Association, so probably legal talk, how that organization is set up and governed in terms of its structure, the Articles of Association for a nonprofit private company say something along the lines of a very small group of individuals, 3 or 5, can form a nonprofit private company and make the commitments then to not derive private gain from that, and all of the money will remain in service of the purposes. But what does that actually mean? And so what we've actually noticed, and we're kind of interested, like I think who was asking about how do you respond to changes? I think Ashland's the conversation there. Well, what we've noticed is in the last few years in Alberta, there's been a large number of nonprofit private companies that have been created, including one by a private equity firm that manages a chain of childcare. So we're thinking, so why would they form a nonprofit private company in Alberta? We've also seen other childcare organizations set up nonprofit private companies. And I think this is something that we need to look much more closely at. What is the attraction of that particular vehicle? So if you went through those 3-4 areas, registered charities, incorporated nonprofits, cooperatives, and nonprofit private companies, you would see different statutes, different requirements in terms of articles of associations, and there's different provisions around dissolution. What happens at dissolution of that nonprofit private company to the assets that are within the company? And it seems as though that nonprofit private company can be dissolved and a for-profit company formed, and the assets then become a capital gain for the new members. So I think we need to look through, when we talk about nonprofits, we need to understand what is it in terms of the values and the approaches and the principles within the nonprofit lexicon that we think is commensurate with the idea of building a publicly funded system. It's not probably all of the same things, so apologize, I have to speed up. So quickly in Saskatchewan and Alberta, 2 provinces side by side. Speak up, sorry. Oh, sorry. 2 provinces side by side, but very different early learning childcare systems. In Saskatchewan, the system is entirely not-for-profit. Now, there are some of these private companies, there's even an extra now provincial non-profit corporation registered federally that's operating a non-profit in Saskatchewan. But essentially a non-profit sector. What that means is that most of those organizations are small charities and small non-profit organizations that operate with a a board, generally a parent board. In Saskatchewan, there's a requirement that it be majority of parents. And they then make decisions about the operation of that organization. There are limits on the size of the centers, which is kind of interesting. I think we've been hearing about very large centers, there's limits on that. And in Saskatchewan, for-profit childcare organizations, if they're incorporated under different statutes, they're not eligible for public funding. So Saskatchewan is a publicly funded system. Alberta sits next door. Alberta's got a system that, or non-system, a sector that is primarily for-profit. And I think it was interesting when Gordon was talking. So we say it's about 65% for-profit in terms of the number of centers. But again, if you do what Gordon did, you look at, say, so how many of the full-time childcares are for-profit, that rises up to 70. And then when you look at geographically and you say, well, what's the profile of centers in Calgary? How does that compare to Edmonton? How does that compare to Grand Prairie? What we find is the for-profit centers are concentrated in the major centers, and Calgary is the leading concentration. So it's got for-profit and non-profit, and both of them were eligible for funding and support under the Canada-wide agreement, and also funding and support for expansion. So I'm just going to quickly jump. 1 minute, okay. So let's get to the final slide. And so what are we learning in terms of talking to charities? We're talking primarily to charities around issues of expansion. What are we learning? And so quick 3 points. Challenges, access to capital. So charitable organizations struggle to have access to capital. Why is that? Well, conventional lenders generally don't want to lend to a charity. And when then you look at the articles of association of that charity, and you say, who is responsible for the incurring of the debt? Who has to provide some personal obligation or commitment to that debt? Often it falls on either the members or the board. So quite reasonably, they're kind of reluctant to take on that debt. So access to capital is a real problem. Same with access to infrastructure, expertise, and workforce. So when you think of a nonprofit small charity, members are often the parents. Parents elect the board, which is often parents. And then the parents appoint the executive director. The executive director is an ECE who's come through an ECE training. So when you say to that executive director, hey, do you want to open a new site? You going to open a new program? You say, no, that's not my area of expertise. And most of the nonprofit charities in Alberta, we've looked at them fairly recently with some ideas and advice from Gordon on how to do that, is that we find some multiple center sites, but they've generally got 2 sites. We find 3 or 4 who have 5 or 6. And then we've got one who's got over 59. And the one that's got over 59 is the YMCA. Most nonprofits have a more community-based, limited in geography and scope, size in terms of understanding who they are and how they operate. So they're facing some real structural challenges around expansion. If we look at some of the lessons around public planning and management, if those nonprofits, the small operators who operate 1 or 2 sites with a parent board and an ED who's not a property developer, if they're going to expand and develop additional sites, they're going to need expertise, infrastructure, resources, advice in terms of public management and planning. You're asking them to undergo a cultural change. You're asking them to go from a single site serving a group of parents in a geographic community to something different. And some of the models we've talked about them in Alberta and Saskatchewan says, well, why don't we just collapse 3 of you and have a super board? Why don't you have 3 charities amalgamating to form a single entity with a super board that has 3, 4, 5 sites? So we're going to have to look at structural change. What we're also going to have to look at is that the public funding is going to have to be sufficient to cover a much greater portion of the acquisition of any assets or resources. And what we've also heard now from charities, this is interesting, something we need to think about. They say, we don't actually want to own the asset. We don't want to own the facility. We want to operate the program, but we don't want the cost of owning and operating facilities. So what does that suggest? That suggests to me, if I think about small communities across Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, maybe the local government has to own the asset and the facility, and then the charity, the non-for-profits, delivers the service. So I'll stop there. No answers, lots of questions. So I look forward to the answers from you. Thanks very much.